She walked in on the unthinkable, her husband in bed with the one person she trusted most, but instead of falling apart, she took matters into her own hands. What happens next will shock you, because revenge doesn't always look the way you expect. Stay tuned to discover how one woman turned betrayal into something far more powerful than anyone could imagine. Lena had always trusted her husband, Mark. They had built a life together, had children, shared dreams, and grown comfortable in their routine. She had always believed in their love, even when things started to feel a little distant. She'd brushed off the late nights, the strange phone calls, the way he'd become distant over time. But that night, something in her gut told her that this time something was different. She came home early from her yoga class, expecting a quiet evening with Mark, maybe a movie, some dinner. She never expected to find him in their bed with another woman. But there he was, lying next to her in the sheets, looking guilty but not ashamed. The woman in his arms wasn't just some stranger. It was Claire, their children's teacher. Lena's mind froze for a moment, unable to comprehend what her eyes were seeing. Claire, the woman who had been to their house for dinners, who had complimented Lena's cooking and even babysat the kids on occasion, was now tangled up in bed with her husband. Lena didn't scream. She didn't rush in to slap them or shout accusations. Instead, she just stood there, rooted to the spot, as the two of them scrambled to pull themselves apart. Mark's face went pale when he saw her standing in the doorway. "Lena," he started, his voice shaky. But Lena didn't let him finish. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but she couldn't bring herself to react. She turned and walked out of the room, her mind spinning. What could she say? What was there to say? It wasn't the first time she'd suspected something wasn't right, but seeing it with her own eyes hit her harder than she could have imagined. She went into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, and pulled out a bottle of wine. Her hands shook as she uncorked it, poured a glass, and sat at the table. She wasn't crying, she wasn't shouting, she wasn't sure what she was feeling at all. Anger, disbelief, it all mixed together. But she knew one thing for sure. Her life had just shattered. Mark walked into the kitchen a few minutes later, looking guilty and lost. "Lena, please," he started, but she cut him off before he could finish. "I don't want to hear it." Her voice was cold, controlled, even though inside she felt anything. Mark tried to apologize, to explain, but Lena wasn't listening. She already knew everything she needed to know. The trust was gone. The marriage was over. But as Mark begged her to forgive him, something dark began to stir inside her. This wasn't just about him betraying her. This wasn't just about the hurt she felt in that moment. No, this was something deeper, something that had been building for years. She didn't just want him to feel guilty. She wanted him to feel everything she was feeling. But more than that, she wanted to take control of this situation. It wasn't about calling the cops. It wasn't about shouting or making a scene. She wanted revenge. She wanted to make them both pay, but she would do it on her terms. Lena stood up slowly, staring at her husband, who was still trying to apologize, his voice trembling. She looked him in the eyes and said, "I'll deal with this my way." Then she walked out, leaving Mark standing there, unsure of what would come next. The days that followed were a blur of emotion for Lena. She didn't go home that night. She didn't know where to go, but she didn't want to face Mark. Not yet. She stayed with a friend, barely sleeping, replaying the events over and over in her mind. She felt numb, but the numbness was slowly being replaced by something else, something colder, more calculating. Lena didn't want to be a victim in this. She didn't want to be the woman who was cheated on, who cried in the corner, while her husband moved on. No, she would do something about this. She would make them pay. Over the next few days, Lena found herself watching Mark and Claire from the shadows. She wasn't ready to confront them, but she needed to understand the full picture. She followed Mark one morning as he left for work, then drove to Claire's house. She didn't have a plan yet, just the raw, pulsing need to know everything. She saw Claire's car parked outside, and for a long time, Lena just sat in her own car staring at the house. It was a nice neighborhood, quiet and suburban, but it felt like a world away from the life Lena had built. She didn't want to be weak. She didn't want to be the woman who cried and begged for her marriage to stay intact. So she started looking for anything that could help her destroy them both, not physically, but emotionally and mentally. She needed leverage. The more Lena watched Claire, the more she understood. Claire wasn't just some innocent teacher. She had her own secrets, little things that didn't add up. She was good at pretending, at playing the role of the perfect teacher, the caring woman who was always willing to help. But there was a darkness there too, a need for control, and Lena could sense it. She began to gather information, making discreet calls to other parents, digging through old social media posts, and collecting any small detail that might give her the power she needed. At the same time, Lena started digging into Mark's life. She had always known there were cracks in their relationship, but she had never realized how deep they went. She found financial records that showed Mark was in debt more than she ever imagined. It wasn't just the affair that had destroyed their marriage. It was the lies, the secrets he had kept hidden from her. He had been keeping things from her for years, and now she had everything she needed to make him pay for it. Lena's plan was slowly taking shape. She wasn't going to scream. She wasn't going to make a scene. She wasn't going to call the cops or get the law involved. She was going to use their own mistakes against them. She would make Mark and Claire pay for everything they had done, for the betrayal they had caused. But she would do it quietly. She would do it so that they wouldn't even see it coming. Every move she made, every piece of information she gathered, was another step closer to the moment when everything would fall apart for them. Lena could feel the power shifting. For the first time since she had walked in on them, she felt like she was in control again. And she wasn't going to stop until they both paid for everything they had taken from her. Lena couldn't stop herself from replaying that night over and over in her mind. The image of Mark and Claire tangled in each other, their faces flushed with guilt and desire, haunted her. Every moment, every word, felt like a slap in her face, but rather than wallowing in grief or rage, she was slowly turning that pain into something sharper. The raw anger she felt was transforming into a deep, simmering determination. She was no longer the wife who had been betrayed. She was becoming something else, a woman who would make them understand what they had taken from her. But even as her plan to destroy them both solidified, she was torn by an uncomfortable question. What would this cost her? Lena knew she wasn't just hurting Mark and Claire, she was playing with fire. She was walking down a path that had no return. What if in the end she didn't feel as powerful as she imagined? What if revenge didn't give her the satisfaction she thought it would? Her mind churned with doubts, but the desire for control, the urge to show them both who held the power, kept her moving forward. She couldn't let herself think about the consequences too much. Every time she found herself questioning her actions, she pushed the thought away. She knew she was capable of this. She had been forced to be strong her entire life. Her childhood had been filled with lessons in survival, and now she would take all of that and apply it to this moment. She could take them down. She could destroy their lives, ruin their reputations, break them the way they had broken her. The more Lena sat with the idea, the more she realized how badly she wanted them to feel the weight of their actions. She didn't want them to just lose their jobs or face embarrassment. No, she wanted them to feel the betrayal she felt every day. She wanted Mark to lose everything, his home, his children, his dignity. And Claire, she wanted to make sure that the woman who had played with her family's trust was never able to ruin anyone else's life again. But there were moments of weakness too. At night, alone with her thoughts, Lena would catch herself wondering if there was any chance to fix things. If maybe, just maybe, Mark would come to his senses, beg for her forgiveness, and they could put this all behind them. But those thoughts were fleeting. They never lasted long. What mattered now was power, control, and justice. And for that, Lena knew there was no room for forgiveness. She pushed the weakness aside and began to set her plan into motion. First, she reached out to a few of Mark's colleagues, making subtle inquiries about his behavior at work. It didn't take long before she heard whispers about his drinking problems, his late nights, and the rumors of his inappropriate behavior with other women. She had always suspected something was off, but now she had the confirmation. This would be part of her ammunition, his personal flaws that no one had ever bothered to address. Next, she focused on Claire. She found out about a few things from the other parents, slips of information that weren't widely known. Claire had been involved in some questionable actions in the past, but they had been kept quiet. A lawsuit over a student's grades, accusations of favoritism, and an affair with a married colleague that had been hushed up. All of it would be the perfect foundation for Lena to build her revenge. As Lena pieced the puzzle together, She couldn't help but feel the power starting to shift in her favor. This wasn't just about the affair anymore. This was about taking back control of her life. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be quick, but she was prepared to wait. She would make them both pay, slowly, in ways they could never predict. It started with Mark. Lena had learned that he was meeting a group of friends for drinks at a bar one night, and she knew this was her opportunity. She went to the bar that evening, a careful smile on her face, a drink in hand. She watched from the corner as Mark and his friends laughed, oblivious to the fact that she was watching him so closely. She noticed how he was trying to hold it together, pretending like everything was normal, but the edges were fraying. It was in the way he spoke to his friends, the way he looked over his shoulder, as if waiting for something or someone. Lena approached him casually as though nothing had happened. She slipped into the booth next to him, her voice smooth but sharp beneath the surface. "Mark," she said, her eyes catching his for the first time in days. He looked at her, confused, then relieved. "Lena, what are you doing here?" he asked, trying to sound casual, but there was panic in his eyes. "Just thought I'd join you for a drink," she replied with a smile, her voice unnervingly calm. Mark looked uncomfortable but didn't say anything. Lena could feel the tension between them like a live wire. She could tell he was waiting for her to speak, to say something, anything about the affair. But Lena didn't. She let the silence hang heavy, savoring the discomfort in his eyes. After a few minutes, Lena leaned forward. "You know," she said, her voice low but firm, "I know what you've been up to. And it's not just about Claire." She watched as Mark's face shifted from confusion to fear. He opened his mouth to speak, but she silenced him with a raised hand. "You're going to lose everything, Mark. Your career, your family, your reputation. I'm going to make sure of it." For the first time in their entire marriage, Mark looked small. He looked terrified. Lena could see the realization in his eyes. This wasn't some empty threat. She had the power to destroy him, and he knew it. But he tried to keep up his bravado, leaning back in his chair and shaking his head. "Lena, you don't want to do this. We can fix things. We can work through it." Lena's smile didn't falter. "No, Mark. You've already made your choice. You made this mess, and now you're going to face the consequences." She stood up to leave, but before she walked away, she dropped one last comment, the one that would stick with him for the rest of the night. "I'll be watching, Mark, and I'll make sure everyone knows who you really are." As she walked out of the bar, Lena's heart raced, not from fear, but from anticipation. She knew that this was just the beginning. She wasn't done yet. Mark's life was about to unravel, and she would make sure it happened in the most public way possible. Her revenge was no longer just a thought. It was becoming real. And soon it would be Claire's turn. The next phase of Lena's plan focused on Claire. It was easy to focus on Mark at first. He was the one closest to her, the one who had betrayed her most deeply. But Claire, the woman who had inserted herself so easily into Lena's life, who had been so comfortable in Lena's world, was the one Lena wanted to expose most. She would be the one who would feel the heat next, and Lena would enjoy every second of it. Lena had been following Claire for weeks now, always staying a step behind, gathering the pieces of information she needed. It wasn't hard to find the cracks in the teacher's picture-perfect life. It was the small things that people didn't pay attention to. The slip of a note from a student's parent that didn't quite add up, a shady conversation with a colleague overheard in the teacher's lounge, the rumors of her own marriage falling apart. Lena had dug deep enough to find that Claire's carefully constructed persona was just as fragile as her own. Claire was living a double life, one as the kind, compassionate teacher, and the other as the woman who secretly preyed on married men. The kind of woman who thought she could never be touched. But Lena would make sure she was. One evening, Lena attended a school event where Claire was speaking. She watched her from the back of the room, taking mental notes on every little thing. Claire was radiant as always, calm and composed, commanding the attention of everyone in the room. She had that teacher aura, the one that made everyone believe she was infallible, that everything she did was for the good of the children. But Lena saw through it. Beneath the polished surface, there was a woman who had no problem crossing lines, breaking trust, and hurting others for her own gain. Lena had been preparing for this moment for weeks. She had recorded conversations from parents who had criticized Claire for her favoritism, and she'd gathered emails that hinted at Claire's past misdeeds. ones that were never fully investigated. Lena had been subtle, biding her time, but now as she watched Claire in the spotlight, Lena realized that she wasn't just going to expose her as a cheater. No, she would dismantle everything. Claire's reputation, her career, her position of power. Lena would destroy it all. The next day, Lena showed up at the school, casually walking the halls as if she belonged there. She made her way to the teacher's lounge, where she overheard Claire talking to a colleague. She was discussing a recent school project, but what caught Lena's attention was the mention of a former affair, a man Claire had once been involved with, someone the school district had swept under the rug. Lena smiled to herself, knowing exactly what she needed to do. She left the room quietly, feeling the rush of power course through her veins. Lena sent anonymous emails to several of the school's board members, including the district head, outlining the affair Claire had once had with a colleague. The affair had been covered up to protect Claire's reputation, but Lena wasn't going to let it stay hidden any longer. The email was detailed, naming dates, places, and other subtle clues that would make it undeniable. It painted Claire as a woman who abused her position of power, someone who had crossed boundaries and manipulated the system. It would only be a matter of time before the board members started asking questions, and once they did, there would be no stopping the storm that would follow. Lena had planted the seeds of destruction, and now she waited. She knew this would take time, but the look on Claire's face when the truth came out would be worth it. For the first time in her life, Lena was playing a game she knew she would win. The power was shifting again, and this time, it was all in her hands. Days passed, and Lena watched from the sidelines as her plan began to unfold. The emails she had sent to the school board started making their rounds, creating whispers in the staff lounge and quiet conversations in the hallways. The affair with the married colleague that had been brushed under the rug was now coming back to haunt Claire, and Lena could almost feel the weight of it from where she stood. It was only a matter of time before the story broke, and when it did, Claire's career would be over. The rumors started to spread, small at first, but enough to make the teacher nervous. Meanwhile, Lena wasn't done with Mark. He had spent the last few days trying to salvage whatever was left of their relationship, trying to convince her that he would change, that he was sorry. But Lena saw through it all. She wasn't interested in empty apologies or promises of a better future. He was weak. He didn't even see the storm brewing around him. Lena had made sure of that. She knew Mark had been meeting with a lawyer, trying to prepare for a potential divorce, but Lena was one step ahead of him. She had already made a few calls to the lawyer's office, just to keep tabs on what Mark was up to. She also had a friend in the legal world who had sent her a copy of Mark's financial records that showed just how deep his lies went. Mark had hidden debts, false investments, and a few shady business dealings he had never told her about. If she needed to, Lena could take him down financially as well. She wasn't afraid to go there. Lena's phone rang one afternoon. It was a call she had been expecting. A school board member had called her back. They had received the email she'd sent, and they were already looking into it. She smiled to herself, knowing that Claire's life was about to implode. The walls were closing in around both of them. Mark with his lies, and Claire with her manipulation of the system. They were both too arrogant to see it coming. As the week went on, Lena stayed quiet, letting everything unfold around her. She watched the cracks form in Mark's and Claire's worlds as they tried to scramble and fix what was already broken. But there was no fixing this. No amount of apologies or damage control could save them now. They had crossed the line, and now Lena was going to make sure they paid the price. Lena wasn't just a woman scorned anymore. She had become a force of nature, and nothing could stop her now. She was about to watch their entire world come crashing down, and she couldn't wait for it to happen. The first cracks in Claire's seemingly perfect world began to appear just a few days after Lena's emails hit the school board. The rumors that had started small started to grow, gaining momentum with every passing hour. Lena could feel the tension in the air. It was palpable. The staff at the school started treating Claire differently. Whispers in the hallways, sideways glances when she walked into the teacher's lounge. Claire didn't know what was happening at first. She had no idea that her past was catching up with her, or that the image she had so carefully constructed was about to crumble. Lena sat back, watching from a distance, as Claire's perfect reputation began to deteriorate. The school board had called Claire in for questioning. The affair, with the colleague that had been buried long ago, was now front and center, and they were digging into every detail. It didn't take long for the truth to come out. How Claire had manipulated situations, how she'd used her position of power to seduce her colleague and then buried the story to protect herself. The board's investigation grew more intense, and with it, Claire's panic. One afternoon, Lena saw Claire storm out of the school building, her face red, her eyes wide with fear. She had been suspended pending further investigation. The damage was done. Lena couldn't help but smile. It wasn't just the affair she'd exposed, it was Claire's entire, carefully constructed life. Her career was on the line, and there was no way out. The woman who had once smiled at Lena over dinner, who had whispered sweet nothings in Mark's ear, was now on the brink of losing everything. Lena felt a rush of satisfaction as she watched the chaos unfold. She had known this was coming, but to see it all play out in front of her was something else entirely. The power she had once felt slipping away was now firmly in her grasp. This was her revenge, and it was beautiful. But even as Lena savored her victory, she knew that it wasn't enough yet. There was still Mark. Claire's downfall was just the beginning. He would pay too. Mark had no idea what was coming next, but Lena did. She had planted the seeds of his destruction weeks ago, carefully positioning herself to strike at just the right moment. She had already begun to take action. Mark's financial issues, his lies, and his hidden debts. Lena had it all. She had contacted a private investigator who had been digging into Mark's business dealings, uncovering more than she ever imagined. The money he had squandered, the businesses he had hidden from her. Lena now held all the cards. It was time to push him to the edge. Mark was already on thin ice, trying to salvage what was left of his relationship with her, but Lena wasn't interested in any more apologies. He had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. She called him that evening, her voice cold and controlled. "Mark," she said, "you've lost your job, your reputation, everything. Do you want to know why?" Mark was silent on the other end, probably still trying to figure out what was going on. "I've been watching," she continued, "and I've made sure that everything you've hidden is going to be exposed. All your debts, your lies, they'll be public soon. I'll make sure everyone knows who you really are." Mark started to protest, but Lena didn't let him speak. "There's no way out for you now. Not this time." The line went dead, and Lena leaned back in her chair, feeling the satisfaction of knowing she had put the final nail in his coffin. Both Mark and Claire were now trapped in the mess they had created. She had taken everything from them, everything they had built, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Lena allowed herself a small smile as she thought about the devastation that was coming their way. The web she had woven was now complete, and there was no way out. They had betrayed her, and now they would pay for it. The days following her conversation with Mark were a blur. The investigation into his finances had picked up speed, and with it, his world began to unravel in ways he hadn't expected. News of his debts spread quickly, reaching the people he had tried so hard to impress. His colleagues began to distance themselves from him, and his clients dropped him one by one. The lies he had built his life on were crumbling, and Lena was there to watch it all fall apart. She had called in a favor from an old contact in the media, a journalist who owed her a favor from years ago. She handed over all the evidence she had gathered about Mark's financial dealings, the shady investments, the lies he had fed to everyone around him. The story broke the next day. His name was plastered across the front page of the local newspaper, and the fallout was immediate. People who had once trusted him were now turning their backs, distancing themselves from the man they had once admired. Mark tried to salvage what was left, but it was too late. The damage had been done. Lena had made sure of that. As the days wore on, Lena received a phone call from Claire. The once confident teacher was now broken, her voice trembling with fear. "Lena," she said, I know what you've done. Please, please don't destroy me." Lena let out a soft laugh, her voice cold and calm. "It's already done, Claire." "You're done? You were never in control, you never saw it coming," Claire begged, but it was clear that her fate was sealed. She had lost everything, her career, her reputation, her future. She was no longer the woman who had taken what she wanted without consequence. Now she was just another casualty of Lena's carefully executed revenge. Lena listened to the desperation in Claire's voice, but she didn't feel sorry for her. She had seen enough. Both Claire and Mark had thought they could have it all without facing the consequences. Now they would face the truth that Lena had been holding over them all along. As she hung up the phone, Lena finally allowed herself a moment of peace. She had taken control of her life, and she had made sure that Mark and Claire paid for what they had done. She wasn't the victim anymore. She had become something else, a woman who had taken her pain and turned it into power. The game was over. And Lena had won. The days that followed were quiet. Too quiet for Lena's liking. It was as though the world had paused, holding its breath, waiting for the dust to settle. Mark's life was in complete shambles. His name was now synonymous with failure and deceit. He'd lost everything: his job, his reputation, and the trust of the people around him. Lena had made sure of it. He no longer had the comfort of pretending. Things would go back to normal, and for Claire the damage was just as severe. The once celebrated teacher was now the subject of gossip, the whispers of her misconduct never far from her ears. The affair had ruined her career, and the scandal would follow her for the rest of her life. But for Lena, the silence was deafening. She had won, yes. She had brought them both to their knees, and there was a strange satisfaction in seeing the chaos unfold. But as the initial rush of triumph wore off, she found herself standing in the ruins, unsure of what to do next. The revenge had been so carefully planned, so perfectly executed, that now when it was all over she almost didn't know how to move forward. For a while, Lena stayed in the same house, the house that had once felt like a home, now just a shell of what it used to be. She passed through rooms filled with memories of a marriage that no longer existed. Every corner of the house seemed to echo with the ghost of what had been. The kids were at their grandmother's for a while, giving Lena the space she needed. It was strange, this empty house. She had been living in a state of emotional upheaval for so long that now, with everything settled, she almost didn't know who she was anymore. But as the days passed, Lena began to realize something. Revenge, no matter how satisfying, couldn't fill the emptiness. She had thought that destroying Mark and Claire would somehow fix everything, that it would make her feel whole again. But now that it was over, she felt like something was missing. She had won, but what had she won? Revenge had given her a sense of justice, a feeling of power, but it hadn't given her the peace she thought it would. One evening, as Lena sat alone in the living room, she realized that she had been living in the shadow of her anger for far too long. Her past, her pain, it had all been defining her, keeping her trapped in a cycle of bitterness and resentment. The truth was, she didn't need to destroy Mark and Claire to prove her strength. She had always been strong. What she needed now was to rebuild her life, to create something for herself that didn't revolve around vengeance. The next morning, Lena made a decision. She packed her things and moved out of the house. It was a clean break. She didn't want to live in the place where all the memories of her broken marriage lingered. She found a small apartment, one she could call her own. It wasn't much, but it was hers. The first night in her new space, Lena stood by the window, looking out at the city below. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of calm settle over her. There was a sense of freedom in this decision, a sense that she was finally taking control of her own future. Over the next few weeks, Lena focused on herself. She started taking yoga again, something she had once loved but had abandoned in the chaos of her marriage. She reconnected with old friends, people who hadn't been part of the betrayal. She found herself laughing again, something she hadn't done in a long time. Lena was rediscovering the woman she had lost along the way. Then one day, as she was cleaning out some old boxes from her past, she came across a letter. It was from a time before everything had gone wrong, before Mark had betrayed her. It was a letter she had written to herself, a reminder of the woman she used to be, the woman who was independent, who believed in herself, and who hadn't needed anyone's approval to feel complete. Reading that letter was like waking up from a long, dark sleep. Lena realized that she hadn't just been lost in her marriage, she had been lost in her own need for validation. She had thought that the approval of others, even of a man who had betrayed her, would make her whole. But the truth was, she had always been whole. She had just forgotten how to see it. With that realization, something inside Lena shifted. She wasn't just a woman who had been wronged anymore. She was a woman who had survived, who had rebuilt herself from the ground up. And now she was ready to move forward, to build a life that was entirely her own, without the shadow of betrayal hanging over her. As the weeks turned into months, Lena found a new rhythm. She found a new sense of purpose, one that didn't involve Mark or Claire. She started a new job, something that had always interested her but that she had put off for years. She began volunteering at a local charity, helping others who had gone through tough times. And through it all, she realized that she had done the right thing, not just by taking control of her situation, but by choosing to let go of the past. In the end, Lena didn't just reclaim her life, she rediscovered who she was, and in doing so she became someone stronger, someone more capable than she had ever realized. She wasn't defined by what Mark and Claire had done to her. She was defined by what she had done for herself, and that she knew was the greatest victory of all. Lena looked out at her new life, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. She had fought the battles, won the war, and emerged stronger. She had become her own savior, and now, for the first time in a long time, she was free.